Hello, and welcome to the first event of Whistling Hens Residency at Collington. You'll, of course, notice that we're not able to do this in person on campus due to the restrictions that remain, but we were bound and determined to make sure that this residency continued as planned, even after coronavirus really messed everything up. So we have 4 events planned for you in this residency, and we got together in advance off campus to make these recordings for you. I'll mention right now a huge thank you to our friend Colin Power for letting us use his very spacious church to record at a safe distance. Now, I'll mention that the recording of American Folk Suite you're going to see today was actually taped at Collington last year. Up until now, we thought we were going to be able to perform live broadcasting from the auditorium today, but a week ago we were told the visitation restrictions were still in place. So I apologize that we can't bring you a fresh recording, but we are definitely doing our best given such short notice.
Before we begin, we want to tell you a bit about how this residency came to be, and we'll mention it in every program. In October of 2019, we applied for the Residency Partnership Program grant through Chamber Music America, which was one of the largest and most famous granting agencies in the US for classical music. We found out in February that we won the grant. Woo! And obviously, when we applied last year, we had no idea how radically things would change for all of us. And we have to give a tremendous thank you to Chamber Music America, first for selecting us as a grant recipient, and second for being so kind, gracious, and flexible and allowing us to adapt this residency to a virtual format. We're so thankful they've continued to support us even in less than ideal conditions, and we certainly hope that this is an enriching and educational experience for you. And at the very least, we hope it's something for you to do while we're in some degree of isolation to keep us all safe as possible.
So another administrative note, you should have received a packet in your mail slot which includes all the information for our entire residency spanning the month of July. We have the dates, information about each program, song text, and more. So please hold on to that until the residency is over, about July 16th. And at the end of the packet, you're going to find 2 things that I'll draw your attention to. The first is a set of coloring pages of women composers. This is something special that we commissioned specifically for this residency. Our original proposal included a music and art activity in the arbor, which obviously had to be majorly adjusted, but the idea was that residents could color along while we were performing the music. The composers that you have are the same composers that we are performing. We think they're just really adorable and also a great resource for kids and music students to keep learning about women composers in unique ways. And secondly, at the end of your packet is a paper survey. This is meant to be filled out after you watch one of our events. If we had been able to do this residency in person, we would have gotten to talk to you and hear about your experience in the moment at the event. We'd be taking pictures and videos and sharing these experiences too with our granting organization. But since we're not able to hear from you live, please, please, please help us out by filling out these surveys for an event or any of the events of your choosing. And lastly, you can find all of this program information and an online version of that survey I just mentioned at www.whistlinghens.com/CMA.
And that's enough administrative talk. Today's program, as the title suggests, takes a look at the intersection and relationship between music and literature. It's apparent how literature and text plays a role for us in terms of the music, since I'm a singer and I am singing words. But beyond that, we're looking at literary excerpts that pair with our music. So we're going to hand it over to Marilu right now, who puts things in historical perspective across generations of strong women.
Several years ago, my sister created a little book telling some of the stories from our grandmothers, great-grandmothers, great-great-grandmothers, and so on. This is a little bit of information to put things in perspective. My 6th great-grandmother was born in 1759 and died in 1780 in childbirth. During her lifetime, there was no United States. There were just colonies ruled by England. Girls and women did not wear underpants, but they did wear stays and shifts. There were no screens for the windows, no cameras, and doctors tried to cure warts by rubbing them with radishes. My fifth great-grandmother was born in 1780 and died in 1847. During her lifetime, houses did not have running water or electricity. Homemade candles were used to light the darkness. Most of the roads, even in towns, were nothing but dirt, which made them muddy when it rained and dusty when it didn't. Toilets were outside in small buildings called privies, which was short for private, but they weren't. My fourth great-grandmother was born in 1812 and died in 1884. During her lifetime, she saw such marvels as the typewriter, the sewing machine, dress patterns, and the lawnmower. The dry martini and packaged cigarettes also made an appearance, but it's doubtful that she partook of either of them. The cast iron stove replaced open hearth cooking. My third great-grandmother was born in 1846 and died in 1928. During her lifetime, indoor plumbing became commonplace, so people didn't have to bathe in the kitchen. Toilet paper was invented, reducing the need to save old Sears catalogs. Horse and buggies gave way to automobiles. Drugstores now carried such essentials as toothpaste in a tube, Coca-Cola, and ice cream cones. My second great-grandmother was born in 1876 and died in 1960. Her life brought on airplanes and houses that were electrified. With electricity, all sorts of luxuries like the iron, the telephone, the wireless radio, and the washing machine. She was there when women got the right to vote, and Mother's Day was founded, and silent movies began to talk, and television came in black and white.
We just love how Marilu's family has captured such a robust view of her many generations of women. And some of our music today will take a microscope to multi-generational women. But we're also going to put our musical texts in perspective. First, by pairing them with contemporary texts to show what other folks were writing about at the same time, or by pairing them with literary counterparts, maybe by pairing them with text describing what women should want or what they should think about, what they should do, and that's going to be contrasted with what women actually wanted, felt, or thought about. And finally, sometimes we'll pair them with a historical overview of women in that medium of art, which you'll hear towards the end. To open, we're going to hear the first movement of Cherise Slider's American Folk Suite, titled Fair and Tender Ladies. Be listening out for her warning.
There
We see the cheeky side of what women wanted. In Whistle, Daughter, Whistle, we hear two generations of women fighting about a saucy subject, as read by Jeannie Bessmer.
Some of you might be familiar with this text if you've ever heard English folk singer Albert Lancaster Lloyd's rendition called Daughter, Daughter, Whistle. He recorded this in 1956 and said in the album liner notes, "This song of the impatient girl who suddenly finds she can whistle when invited to whistle for a man is known in many traditions, including Yiddish and Latin American. It has been suggested that the song means more than meets the ear, and that whistling is part of the witch's technique to summon the powers of darkness when she wants to realize a desire. Akin to this belief is the sailor's horror of whistling for fear of raising a storm. Somehow, though, the girl in the song sounds too healthy for a witch."
This next movement, Johnny Has Gone for a Soldier, is written from the perspective of a woman mourning the departure of her beloved soldier. Paired with that is a reading by Steve Woodbury. He is reading a letter from Ken Chapin, written to his wife during World War II while he was abroad. We chose this letter first because it's beautiful, and second, because it is a real letter written by the composer's grandfather to her grandmother. Cherise Leiter wrote a whole piece called Love Letters from a War, which sets 11 letters and diary entries of her grandfather's writings to her grandmother. Her grandmother kept every single one of Ken's letters. When the piece was premiered, Cherise flew her 90-something-year-old grandmother in to hear the piece, and she says there was not a dry eye in the audience. We think you'll hear why.
November 2, 1944. Hiya, Toad. There's a deck of cards lying here on the desk, and I nonchalantly thumbed through. I realized you're the queen of my heart and the last girl in the deck of my dreams. So I laid the Queen of Hearts on top of the deck, and now I'm imagining that she is you. To this lovely Queen of my heart, I'll dedicate my entire life and strive until my dying day to make her proud that she's my wife. And when and if a baby comes, the baby too my life will share. I'll work till all my fingers bleed to give them both the best of care. I have a huge and bountiful supply of sweet nothings for your ears and soft caresses for your cheek, enough to last 1,000 years. Darling, I hope that you'll be satisfied. With bowing heart, I ask if you'll be so kind as to accept this small offering, my unworthy self, and this love of mine. Ken Chapin.
Moving on into the realm of prescriptive texts, that is, texts which were telling women what they should do and think. Here we're going to hear from Pat Zelman reading from a magazine called Good Wife, printed in 1955. Now, contrast what society was telling women to do and want versus what the women in Movement 4 of American Folk Suite actually wanted. The movement is titled The Housewife's Lament / Single Ladies.
From Housekeeping Monthly, May 1955. The Good Wife's Guide. Have dinner ready. Plan ahead, even the night before, to have a delicious meal ready on time for his return. This is a way of letting him know that you have been thinking about him and are concerned about his needs. Most men are hungry when they come home, and the prospect of a good meal, especially his favorite dish, is part of the warm welcome needed. Prepare yourself. Take 15 minutes to rest so you'll be refreshed when he arrives. Touch up your makeup. Put a ribbon in your hair and be fresh looking. He has just been with a lot of work-weary people. Be a little gay and a little more interesting for him. His boring day may need a lift, and one of your duties is to provide it. Clear away the clutter. Make one last trip through the main part of the house just before your husband arrives. Gather up school books, toys, paper, etc., and then run a dust cloth over the tables. Over the cooler months of the year, you should prepare and light a fire for him to unwind by. Your husband will feel he has reached a haven of rest and order, and it will give you a lift too. After all, catering for his comfort will provide you with immense personal satisfaction. Prepare the children. Take a few minutes to wash the children's hands and faces if they're small, comb their hair, and, if necessary, change their clothes. They are little treasures, and he would like to see them playing the part. Minimize all noise. At the time of his arrival, eliminate all noise of the washer, dryer, or vacuum. Try to encourage the children to be quiet. Be happy to see him. Greet him with a warm smile and show sincerity in your desire to please him. Listen to him. You may have a dozen important things to tell him, but the moment of his arrival is not the time. Let him talk first. Remember, his topics of conversation are more important than yours. Make the evening his. Never complain if he comes home late or goes out to dinner or other places of entertainment without you. Instead, try to understand his world of strain and pressure and his very real need to be at home and relax. Your goal, make sure your home is a place of peace, order, and tranquility, where your husband can renew in body and spirit. Don't greet him with complaints and problems. Don't complain if he's late home for dinner or even if he stays out all night. Count this as minor compared to what he might have gone through that day. Make him comfortable. Have him lean back in a comfortable chair or have him lie down in the bedroom. Have a cool or warm drink ready for him. Arrange his pillow and offer to take off his shoes. Speak in a low, soothing, and pleasant voice. Don't ask questions about his actions or question his judgment or integrity. Remember, he is the master of your house, and as such will always exercise his will with fairness and truthfulness. You have no right to question him. A good wife always knows her place.
One day I was walking, I heard a complaining, and saw an old woman, the picture of gloom. She gazed at the mud on her doorstep, 'twas raining, and this was her song as she wielded her broom. Oh, when I was single, I went dressing fine. Now I am married, go ragged all the time. Lord, I wish I
Next, we hear from women's history scholar Heather Hyuck, giving us insight into the roles women play in our world. And then you'll hear a little bit of one particular lady's role in the final movement of American Folk Suite called Jubilee.
There was a time when most American history was about names and dates and battles, about men and by men. But the past 50 years has seen an amazing, incredible explosion of research on women's history. And in that process, we've come to realize the incredible variety of experiences women have had in American history. You cannot do American history without fully telling the story of women's history. If you think about women's history, you can think about women playing three intertwined, crucial roles. The first is obvious. Women bear children and care for them, as well as for the elderly, the sick, and so on. So they play a key role in our society, making sure that everyone is doing okay. Until the 1920s, to bear a child, to be pregnant, risked the woman's life as well as today it still does. That's when new drugs came in and new methods to help mothers survive having their children. The second key role is production, especially before electricity and other kinds of help. Simply fixing dinner was a major project. Making a cup of tea included getting the wood, having the fire, boiling the water, and everything else before you got to the cup of tea. Production also includes making all the clothing that was hand sewn, all the medicine, and huge quantities that we don't appreciate of garden, vegetables and fruits, canning and preserving food, as well as making sure that everyone was well cared for. Huge quantities of butter and eggs were sold, often to help pay taxes and to get cash. The third major role that women played in many different societies was social reproduction, taking care to make sure that different people connected with each other, worked together, and supported each other. So everything from the Girl Scouts to sororities to professional organizations. And they did this in a time when women had serious disabilities that were created socially. We hear a lot about women getting the vote. That was one of many demands that women made. They wanted access to money and credit. They wanted to be able to keep their children if they had to get divorced. They wanted to have alcohol controlled so that their husbands didn't drink literally all their wages on a Friday and then come home and take it out on their wives. So we have many things that women have done. We have much more to appreciate, and the research has made a huge difference these past years.
It's all out on the old rail road, it's all out on the sea, all out on the old rail road as far as I can see. Swing and turn, Jubilee, live and learn, Jubilee. Hardest work I ever done, working on the farm, easiest work I ever done, swinging my true
one of the things I loved about putting this event and residency together was getting to learn things about Collington residents that probably would not have otherwise come up in our dinner conversations or, passing each other in the hallway. Bonnie Cronin is the head of the Women's History Committee. And when I told her about this grant award, ages ago, she was so enthusiastic about supporting us in any way that she could. It just so happens that she has a personal connection to the historical context of the next piece, which you're going to hear about in her discussion of Chinese poetry.
Jenny Brandon, Multitudinous Stars and Spring Waters. Multitudinous Stars and Spring Waters represents a collection of poets from a vast period of Chinese history. The poems in it come from the collection of poem, Women Poets of China, which explores poetry from many centuries, both attributed to and written by women poets. Throughout the centuries, Chinese women were not allowed to share their poetry in public. They were basically property of their husbands, having no rights to money, property, or education. Poetry was written in secret, often destroyed or shared only amongst other women. It has been just in the 20th century that Chinese women poets began freely to share their poetry, and historians paid attention to their writings. One exception was Li Qingzhao, who lived in the 11th century at the end of the Song dynasty. She is considered a great master poet. How was her success possible? According to my niece, a scholar of Chinese history and literature, she had both undeniable talent and the ability to withstand harsh criticism. She lived at a time of great political upheaval, as Laurie says, when the rules get lax and poetry gets inspired. The following information comes from a Beijing-based volume of the monthly Reading Journal. For centuries, Chinese women's poetry has seldom been the focus of the scholarly community. In particular, studies on women writers in the Ming, 14th through the 17th century, and the Qin, 17th to early 20th century dynasties, the best documented period in Chinese history, has long been neglected by modern researchers of literature. Women Writers of Traditional China, an anthology of poetry and criticism, was first published by Stanford University Press in 1999 and broke new ground in illuminating the development of Chinese women poets. The anthology brings together representative selections from the work of over 120 poets from the Han Dynasty, 200 BC to AD 200, to the early 20th century. The editors said the primary purpose of this anthology was to place before the English-speaking reader evidence of the poetic talent that flourished against the odds among women in pre-modern China. One of the highlights of the anthology is the 100 featured poets from the Ming-Qin period who have not appeared in general anthologies of Chinese poetry. Chinese women's writing reached its golden age during this Ming and Qin dynasties. Female education was far more popular among the elite in this period than ever before in Chinese history. Clearly, literacy inspired some women to think far beyond the confines of their traditional female sphere. Despite the constraints faced by educated Chinese women, education was empowering for women, giving them a means of self-expression and participation in the formation of an elite culture. Quote, female literacy was encouraged in the upper classes. The literati liked to marry learned women and exchange poems with them, unquote, said Li Kang-yi Sun Chang. Stepping into the 20th century, the May 4th movement in 1919 exerted powerful influences on China's scholars. They condemned Confucianism and traditional society. Women of bygone days were seen as passive victims of the traditional society, and those women writers were either disregarded or condemned as products of a feudal system because they were full of old moral concepts. In the male-dominated realm of poetry, Chinese women faced a particularly difficult challenge in developing their own voice, precisely because men had defined the genre. On one hand, women carried on the tradition of writing poetry started by men. On the other, they injected their own concerns into the genre and began to develop their own themes and forms of self-revelation. They reinscribed literary codes and topics in constructing their own forms of subjectivity, and thereby achieved a genuine tradition of women's writing in late imperial China. The poets included empresses, imperial concubines, courtesans, grandmothers, recluses, Buddhist nuns, widows, painters, and farmers' wives. They were either from the culture center or remote border areas. Each woman had her own reasons for poetry and her own way of writing. Some women wrote out of isolation and despair, finding in words a mastery that otherwise eluded them. Some dwelt on intimate family matters and cast their poems as addresses to husbands and sons at large in the wide world of men's affairs. Of course, some of them were far from accomplished poets, but their works reveal a colorful inner world of common women. The poems used in Jenny Brandon's Multitudinous Stars and Spring Waters make up the larger picture of love and waiting, sometimes with disappointment and grief, of admiration, of marriage and of eternal love. These feel like fragments of thoughts, like what you'd think silently to yourself before and after the bigger declaration of the messages from the three larger poems.
page of the book blows a surging flute. Take away your veil of stars, let me worship the splendor of your face. You and I have so much love that it burns like a fire, burns like a fire, burns like a fire, in which we bake a lump of clay, molded into a figure of you and a figure of me. Then we take both of them and break them into pieces, and mix the pieces with water, and mold again a figure of you and a figure of me.
Thank you so much for tuning in to our kickoff event for the Whistling Hens July Residency. You can fill out a survey about the event by visiting www.whistlinghens.com/CMA. Or you can fill out the paper version at the end of your program booklet and return it to Natalie Groom's mail slot number 2206. Please put our next event, in your calendar. It's going to be Friday, July 10th at 7 p.m. We're going to feature two living composers, Ashy Day, who is local to the DC area, and Diana Rosenblum, who is based in Rochester, New York. We'll be performing one piece by each composer, and we'll have 3 short interviews intertwined. one with Ashy, one with Diana, and one where we have a group session with the composers discussing their writing approach to our unusual instrumentation of soprano and clarinet duo. We hope you'll join us. We're really excited about it. Thank you. Have a great evening.